The dramatic story of Pocahontas, the young Indian woman who saved Smith and married John Rolfe, took place in Virginia, the first permanent English colony in North America between 1607 and 1732. England was to start 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. What caused this great interest in the colonies? Why did the English government encourage it? The answer to these questions are found in two great changes that took place in England. One change was economic, the other was religious. An economic revolution. The changes in the England economy have been called an economic revolution. As a result of the revolution, some people gained great wealth, while others were plunged into poverty. To both the wealthy and the poor, colonies in America offered opportunity and hope. Strange as it may seem, the revolution began with sheep. In the 1500s, the demand for woolen clothes in Europe soared. To meet the demand, English landowners enclosed farms, fencing off large areas as grazing lands for sheep. Manufacturers, in turn, spun and wove wool into cloth. Manufacturers in turn spun the wool and wove the wool into cloth, and the merchants sold throughout Europe. This trade brought great wealth to landowners, wool manufacturers, and merchants, many of whom began looking for an investment in new wealth. To invest means to use money to help a business get started to grow, with the hope that you will earn profit. As you'll see, colonies began looking like a good investment. The uprooted. While the wool trade brought wealth to some, it caused great hardship in countless English families. For generations, farmers had rented small plots of large land. When landowners enclosed these fields to raise sheep, their farmers lost their farms and their jobs. Uprooted men and women and children drifted from the countryside into town and city looking for work. Many were reduced to begging and stealing to survive. Is it any wonder that many of these desperate people would risk the long voyage to North America and hope for a fresh start in a colony? English leaders, too, saw colonies as a way to solve the problem of growing numbers of poor. Worried by the swarms of idle persons, one observer noted, "If we seek not some ways for their foreign employment, we must provide shortly more prisons and corrections for their bad conditions." This idea of sending idle persons to colonies fit well with the government's policy of mercantilism. England wanted to sell more to other countries than it brought in. In colonies, England's poor had produced raw materials such as lumber and that the England would otherwise have to buy from foreign nations. At the time, the colonists would buy England's manufactured goods, thus adding to the nation's wealth. Religious conflict. Meanwhile, conflict over religion was causing others in England to think of starting colonies. In the mid-1500s, England had broken away from the Roman Catholic Church and established the Church of England. By law, all English people had to worship in this new Protestant church. Not everyone accepted the Church of England, though. On the one hand, many English Catholics wanted to keep their religious faith. Some English Protestants, on the other hand, thought the Church of England was too much like the Catholic Church. These people were called Puritans because they believed in a simpler, purer form of worship. The government in England tried to force both Catholic and Puritans to accept the Church of England. According to William Bradford, who later became the governor of Plymouth Colony, some Puritans were taken and clapped up in prisons. Others had their houses watched at night and hardly escaped. Both Catholics and Protestants began thinking of colonies in North America as a place where they might practice their religion without interference. Thus, conflict over religion, as well as new wealth and desperate poverty, pushed England into the era of colonization. Virginia, the first colony. Merchants found the first permanent English colony in Virginia. They hoped to find precious metals and other raw materials that England needed. Establishing a colony was expensive and risky. Thus, some merchants organized the Virginia Company of London. It was a joint stock company, a business that raised money by selling shares called stock to investors. The profits were divided among the investors according to the number of shares each had. In a document called a charter, the King, James I, granted Virginia Company the right to plant or establish colonies in Virginia. Investors eagerly bought stock. As a result, the company was able to buy the ships and supplies needed to launch a colony, building Jamestown. In the spring of 1607, 105 men and boys sailed up a broad river in the Chesapeake Bay. They named the river the James River of their settlement in Jamestown in honor of the king. From the first, Jamestown was in trouble. Ignoring orders from the Virginia Company, the leaders located the settlement in well swampy ground. The only drinking water was salty. The air swarmed with mosquitoes. Disease spread rapidly. Then, instead of planting crops, the colonists rushed off to search for gold. And Captain John Smith later wrote, waiter wrote, "There was no talk, no hope, no gold, but dig gold, wash gold, refine gold, load gold." Too late, too late did they learn that their gold was really fool's gold. Hard times. During the first 7 months in Jamestown, 73 colonists died of hunger and disease. The rest owed their lives to inspired leadership of John Smith and a friendship with Pocahontas. After Smith took control of the colony in 1608, he forced the settlers to plant crop and declared, "He that will not work shall not eat." More supplies also arrived from England. So did more colonists. A year later, Smith was burned in a gunpowder explosion and returned to England. Without him, the colony fell in disorder. As supplies ran out, people ate rats to stay alive. The winter of 1609 and 1610 became known as the starving times. When spring came, only 60 of the 500 colonists were alive. Changes in Virginia. Hope for survival of the colony came from tobacco, an American wheat that had become very popular in England. The soil in Virginia was ideal for growing tobacco, and in 1612, John Rolfe, husband of Pocahontas, developed a method of drying and shipping it to England. Tobacco exports sold. Exports are goods that are sent from one country to sell in another. The Virginia Company was pleased by the new tobacco. However, life in Jamestown was very hard, and few English people wanted to live there. To stir up their investment in 1606, the company brought Pocahontas and John Rolfe to England. Wherever Pocahontas went, she caused a sensation. Merchants, church leaders, and even the king and queen were eager to meet her. To attract more settlers, the Virginia Company also made several important changes in the colony. First, in 1618, the company gave colonists the right to own land. Until then, the company owned all the land in Virginia. Now people who paid their way to the colony were granted 50 acres, and they received another 50 acres for each new settler they brought with them. Indentured servants. To encourage settlers who could not afford to pay their own way to Virginia, the company allowed them to come as indentured servants. That is, they signed a contract called indenture, agreeing to work 4 to 7 years without pay for the person who paid their passage. At the end of the period, indentured servants were free. Usually they received some new clothes and perhaps money or tools to help them start supporting themselves. It was an indentured servant that many of England's uprooted farmers came to the colony. They were willing to set out for new land and hoped that at the end of the contract they could find work or buy a plot of farmland. In 1619, the company sent 90 young women to Virginia. It hoped that settlers who married and started families would make Virginia a permanent home. Many of the women married at once. Each husband paid the cost of his wife, transportation, and tobacco. The women who did not marry became indentured servants, the House of Burgesses. The year 1619 also marked the first step towards self-government in Virginia. Until then, the Virginia Company had appointed the governor and his council as advisors. Now the company allowed adult male landowners to elect representatives, people who are chosen to speak and to act in government for their own citizens. The system was more like that one in England. Their citizens had a voice in the government through representation. They elected a legislature called a parliament. A legislature is a group of people chosen to make laws. In Virginia, the representatives called burgesses were to meet in the assembly called the House of Burgesses. The assembly, along with governor's council, became the colony's legislature. It gave English colonists a degree of self-government that was unheard of at the time in Spanish and French colonies in America. Conflict between colonists and England. Tobacco gave settlers a valuable product to sell. The new tobacco farms spread along the James River. Soon planters were expected to expanding into lands of neighboring Indian tribes. Conflict erupted as Indians tried to protect their land and families. In March 1622, Indian warriors attacked the colony, killing 340 settlers. One of them was John Rolfe, whose marriage to Pocahontas had given hope and peace between Indian and colonists. Pocahontas had died of smallpox in England. The colonists struck back with such a thoroughness that they broke the power of the Virginia tribes. In one example of revenge described by colonist Robert Bennett, 200 Indians were killed at a peace conference because the wine they drank was sent of purpose to poison them. A royal colony. The warfare left much of Jamestown in ruins and Virginia Company in serious difficulties. In 1624, only 1,200 colonists remained, and the investors had lost nearly $5 million. As a result, King James took the Virginia's company charter. He made Virginia a royal colony, which means the king appointed the governor and the council of advisors. James tried to do away with the House of Burgesses, but the Virginians insisted on having a voice in the government. Like the struggling colony, the House of Burgesses clung to life. The Plymouth Colony. The colony of Virginia had been started by investors and adventurers looking for profits and gold. The people who planted the next English colony were seeking something far different, the right to worship as they wished. They became known as pilgrims because they made their journey for religious reasons. Earlier in this section, you read about conflict between Catholics and Puritans in the Church of England. Most Puritans stayed within the church and tried to change it. The Pilgrims, however, were Puritans who decided to set up a separate church, because they were breaking English law, they were persecuted. A small group of pilgrims fled to the Netherlands where they could worship as they wished, but they feared their children would grow up more Dutch than English. As a result, a number of pilgrims decided to establish their own community in North America. King James gave them permission to settle north of Jamestown as long as they did not disturb trouble. In September 1620, about 100 voyagers set off for Plymouth, England, in a leaky, overcrowded boat named the Mayflower. One-third of them were pilgrims. The others were non-pilgrims, or strangers, who planned to settle Virginia. The Mayflower Compact. After a stormy 66-day voyage, the Mayflower reached the American coast of Cape Cod in the region of England called New England. The ship had been blown far north of Virginia, where the pilgrims had permission to settle. The laws in their charter applied only to Virginia, so a group decided that they must organize their own government. Pilgrim leaders drafted an agreement known as the Mayflower Compact, which 41 pilgrims and strangers signed on board the Mayflower. In the compact, the signers agreed to make laws for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due obedience. Dated November 21st, 1620, the Mayflower Compact held an establishment of American tradition that government rests on the consent of the governed. Help from Squanto. Their early history in Plymouth is one of suffering. The site was barren. Half the colonists sickened and died during the first year. Like the settlers in Jamestown who relied on Pocahontas, the pilgrims owed their survival to to an Indian. His name was Squanto, and he was a Wampanoag, who had been to England and could speak English. Squanto's story is not unusual as you might think. Since 1500s, English fishermen and Indians had been trading along the Atlantic coast. Some captains kidnapped Indians to sell as slaves. Squanto was captured in 1614 and sold in Spain. Squanto escaped to England, where he lived for several years before being sent to the Newfoundland. Unhappy there, Squanto returned to England and found a ship headed for Cape Cod. When he arrived in late 1619, he discovered that disease had wiped out his entire village. To the pilgrims, Squanto must have seemed like a gift from God. He not only taught the colonists about farming, but helped them establish friendly relations with neighboring tribes. Sadly, Squanto died of diseases brought to America by the people he did so much to help. The Pilgrims contribute. Despite Squanto's help, Plymouth colony never prospered. In 1691, it was taken over by the nearby colony in Massachusetts. Plymouth, however, remains important in our nation's history. The Pilgrims believed that the people have the right to create their own laws and worship as they wish. Such ideas were among the building blocks of the government we have today.